I have existed from the morning of the world, and I shall exist until the last star falls from the night. Although I have taken the form of Gaius Caligula, I am all men as I am no man, and therefore I am a little g God. Gaius Caligula, one of the most reviled emperors in history. But what if I told you that the vast majority of North Americans have a great deal in common with this reviled emperor from Rome? Gaius Caligula hated crowds, hated people, loved his peace and his solitude and his cleanliness. In fact, he went to an extent to achieve this that no other emperor did. In today's video, I'm going to outline this for you because it speaks to a lot of what's going on in modern society today. And it's also going to open up another investigation that I closed a long time ago that many of you have asked me to reopen. Gaius Caligula also said, "Would that the Roman people had a single neck," in order to cut off their head. That's how much he had a distaste for crowds as a whole, for the people as a whole. Now, what did he do to achieve this? He had commissioned 2 enormous vessels built on a lake that's only about a mile long and 3/4 of a mile wide. They're called the Nemi ships, and they were recovered by Benito Mussolini in the 30s. Now, these ships exceeded anything that had been built before. He had one built as his private residence, and he had another built as a temple of worship. Now, some believe that he was worshiping Diana, but when you look closer at the history, it's really more clear that he was worshiping Isis. Because the one thing men like this fear is having anything in common with other men. And what do we know of all men? We all die. We all have a date where we expire. And that's not something he could accept, ergo the first quote. So out in the middle of this little lake, mile long, 3/4 of a mile wide, these ships were built. And the size of them and the scope of them and what they had aboard were so far beyond anything of that era. Most modern scientists can't wrap their head around it. His private residence had hot and cold running water. They had bilge pumps. They had these thousands of rowers, and you can see it kind of on the sides here. Let me see if I can get a closer picture. Where these rowers could enter and exit and never once interact with him in his inner private courtyard. You see, Rome at this time, this is something that a lot of people would miss, must have smelled horrible. They had no plumbing of any real kind. I mean, they had running water. But that many thousands of people only bathing occasionally with almost no knowledge of sanitation, the place would have reeked. Out here in the middle of this lake, out in the middle of nowhere, he could have had his own little private sanctuary that he could have kept incredibly clean. Now, some of you are going to know what I'm talking about, how this mates up with what's going on today with the whole idea of not being around people. One of the initial things that they rolled out with the whole 2020 sniffles was the 6-foot distancing and the staying at home and shutting of everything down. Because there's a group in our society right now that identifies with Caligula. Because when it's revealed that even us in our lily white, mansions can get sick. Well, we can't have this. We have to start making rules for all of them. I mean, we won't follow those rules, but we have to make rules for all of them. And we're seeing this now, aren't we? This is what Caligula did. And this was a hallmark of the Axis powers. This group of people, Mussolini and Hitler and his group, they had a certain level of disgust for the quote-unquote hoi polloi, for the common man. They wanted to separate themselves, and this is why Mussolini had that lake drained to bring these ships to the surface. Now he built two, one for himself and one where he could worship. Seems kind of strange, but this man did, through all of his flaws, acknowledge that he was a man amongst men and needed to become a god in order to achieve anything where he could look himself in the mirror and say, I am okay. Because accepting the fact that he was just a man was intolerable. Now, in the wiki for this is what they admit, and this is just an amazing thing at the time, because the Romans were very advanced. The first ship, hull is divided into 3 active or main sections. The general shape of the hull appears wider at the stern and narrower at the bow. Pardon me. In fact, the main section is not amidships, but is displaced toward the stern. The superstructures appear to have been made of 2 main blocks of 2 buildings each, connected by stairs and corridors. That's how big this ship was. Built on raised parts of the deck at either end. The distribution gives the ship a discontinuous look and has no similarity to any other ancient construction, meaning this ship was built differently than any other previous ship. The second ship was a little bit more classic, but it had a role. Being out in the middle of that lake had a role. This is an actual photo, by the way, after they drained the lake. And you can see there's workers here. You can see how big this ship was. And this was built 2,000 years ago for one purpose and one purpose only. So that this man, who believed himself to be a little g god, could get away from the crowds and have guaranteed privacy. Also, in the wiki, technology. This is just amazing. Both ships had several hand-operated bilge pumps that worked like a modern bucket dredge. Piston pumps supplied the 2 ships with hot and cold running water via lead pipes 2,000 years ago. The hot water supplied baths, while the cold operated fountains and supplied drinking water. Now think about this for just 1 minute. If you were to go into the ancient world, somehow, let's say there was a time machine, and you had to be there for any amount of time, you would find a way, somehow, with any knowledge that you had, to live someplace that was clean and sanitary and had both hot and cold running water. And you would try to probably stay away from the large city centers of the ancient world. It would take you about 5 seconds to realize how disgusting they were. So in this respect, many, many North Americans would have a great deal in common with Caligula. Now, you ready for the part that's going to blow your mind? Lake Nemi, just south of Rome. I'm sure some of you can already see it. It's the smaller of these 2 lakes right here. This is Lake Nemi. A mile long, 3/4 of a mile wide. He didn't build these ships to go on giant naval conquests. He built these ships to get away from people, to get away from the large crowds. Up here's Rome. Not the big lake, but the little lake. It's a volcanic lake. It's a giant crater. But I'm sure some of you have already seen it. For those of you that haven't, I'll adjust the map. Are you seeing it yet? Now do you see it? I'm not sure what significance this has with the story, but I have some suspicions that there are certain shapes all around the world that identify with a certain belief system. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It is there. Many have asked, why haven't you done anything more with the Pentagon Network? I wanted my finds to have some meaning. One can find that shape, whether it's planned or whether it's ancient or whether it's coincidence, all around the world, but this has meaning. Because the Emperor Caligula, when given his choice and given all the power of the world, literally at that time he had all of the power in the world. What he chose to do was go find a little lake surrounded by trees and commission 2 giant ships to be built in the middle of that lake. And then he would have his own chosen group of people to occupy those ships, and he would have no other contact with the outside world. At his wish. And I'm sure there are many people out there right now thinking, man, that sounds kind of pleasing, kind of appetizing. Man, I wish I could have my own private barge, hot and cold running water, servants, and never have to have contact with large groups, large societies, large cities ever again. That's what this evil emperor wanted. It really does make you sit back, it does make you sit back and think a little bit about how history has colorized people in a way that may not be entirely accurate. And I guess I'll leave that there. God bless. Like, share, subscribe. And we will see you guys tonight on Twitch.